In the summer of 1910, a maid entered room 104 of the Hotel Lincoln in New York City and stumbled upon a sight so grotesque it would never be forgotten. A man lay dead on the bed, his face unrecognizable, his body bruised, and his pockets stuffed with strange handwritten notes. No name, no luggage, no record of ever checking in. It was as if the man had appeared out of thin air and vanished into death just as mysteriously. What followed was a case that baffled police, terrified hotel staff, and fascinated the public. Anonymous letters, whispers of secret societies, coded messages, and a burial in an unmarked grave all combined to transform this unknown man into one of the strangest mysteries in New York history. This is the story of the forgotten corpse of room 104, a story of secrecy, paranoia, and unanswered questions that lingers to this day. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the Macabre Record so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. And drop a comment below telling us, where in the world are you listening from? The Hotel Lincoln was a towering presence on New York's West Side, one of those grand establishments that promised both luxury and discretion. Guests came and went, their names scribbled into ledgers, their trunks carried upstairs by bellboys. But on that sweltering afternoon in July 1910, the routines of the hotel came to a halt when a chambermaid, carrying fresh linens, unlocked the door to room 104. The moment she stepped inside, the air seemed wrong, thick, heavy, almost rancid. At first, she thought perhaps a guest had left spoiled food behind, but when her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the curtains, she saw the figure on the bed. The man lay motionless, fully dressed in a dark suit that had grown rumpled and damp with sweat. His shoes were still polished, though scuffed at the tips, as if he had walked a long way before collapsing. His face, however, was something else entirely. The skin had taken on a waxy pallor, the lips stained dark as though he had swallowed something toxic. Around his eyes and neck were faint bruises, bluish and irregular. On the nightstand beside him sat a bottle of cheap whiskey, only half empty, its glass smeared with fingerprints. The maid staggered backward, dropping her linens in shock. She rushed into the hall, her cries echoing through the corridor, pulling other staff members from their duties. A bellboy and the night clerk hurried up the stairs, half expecting a drunken guest. But when they entered room 104, the stench of decay hit them at once, followed by the silence of death. The man was not drunk, he was gone. What unsettled the staff even more was what the body lacked. There was no suitcase, no hat, not even a comb or handkerchief. No one had seen him check in. No one had helped him with luggage. When the desk clerk flipped through the register, there was no signature that matched the man upstairs. It was as if he had never officially entered the hotel at all. The staff whispered to one another in frightened tones. Who was he? How had he come to be in that bed without ever passing through the lobby like every other guest? Fear spread through the halls as rumors began to form. Some insisted he had been murdered, smuggled in under the cover of night. Others said he had poisoned himself, hiding away to die in anonymity. Whatever the truth, the corpse in room 104 was not just a dead man. He was a riddle, one that would soon entangle the city itself. Word of the body travelled faster than any official report could. Within minutes of the maid's screams, the upper floors of the hotel were alive with murmurs. Guests stepped into the corridor in their dressing gowns, demanding to know what had happened. Some claimed to smell the sour, heavy odour seeping from the open door of room 104. Others whispered wild theories, a lover's quarrel gone wrong, a robbery, even a case of contagious illness. In an age still haunted by recent outbreaks of cholera and influenza, the very idea of a diseased corpse lying just down the hall sent shivers through the wealthier travellers, many of whom had fled crowded boarding houses for the safety of the Lincoln's polished halls. The hotel manager, a balding man with a nervous twitch, tried desperately to calm the situation. He urged the staff to keep quiet, to say nothing until the police arrived. But it was already too late. A pair of curious guests who had crept past the maid caught a glimpse of the figure sprawled on the bed. By the time they returned downstairs, they had already told a version of the story that sounded far darker than the truth. One claimed to have seen blood splattered across the room. Another swore the man's throat had been cut. The rumors spread like a stain through the building, whispered from floor to floor, until every guest knew that something terrible had happened. The night clerk, frantic to protect the reputation of the establishment, tried to usher people back to their rooms, promising that it was a mere fainting spell, nothing more. But the expressions on the faces of the chambermaids and bellboys betrayed the truth. Their pale, frightened eyes told a different story, one that no denial could erase. By the time the first policeman arrived, the hotel was simmering with fear and morbid excitement. Guests crowded the stairwell, straining to hear every word exchanged in hushed tones by the officers. It was said one wealthy widow, clutching her pearls, demanded to be moved to another hotel immediately, declaring that she would not spend another night under a roof where death roamed unchecked. Others, perversely, wanted to know every detail, pressing the staff for answers they did not have. What made it worse was the growing suspicion that this man was not just another unlucky soul. Something about his presence felt unnatural, as though he had slipped past the boundaries of ordinary life and death. And when the police entered the room and began their inspection, they discovered something that made the mystery deepen even further. The man upstairs was not listed in the hotel at all. According to the ledger, room 104 had been empty. Two uniformed policemen entered room 104 with a deliberate calm meant to quiet the watching crowd, but inside the chamber, their composure began to falter. The air was thick and heavy, the drapes drawn just enough to cast the corpse in half-shadow. One officer muttered that the man had been dead for at least a day, maybe longer, judging by the stiffness in his limbs. Yet no one in the bustling corridors of the Lincoln had noticed anything. No sounds of struggle, no cries for help, not even the scent of decay until the door had been opened. It was as though the death had been sealed behind the door, waiting for discovery. The officers began their inspection with methodical precision. They examined the whiskey bottle, turning it over for fingerprints. A few faint smudges clung to the glass, but nothing clear enough to preserve. The bedclothes were rumpled, the sheets tangled, as though the man had thrashed in his final hours. A single chair in the corner had been knocked over, its legs scraping the wooden floorboards. On the nightstand lay a matchbook from a bar in the Bowery, though none of the staff recalled seeing the man leave or return to the hotel. What unsettled the police most, however, was the hotel's own paperwork. The clerk insisted that room 104 had not been rented. The ledger for that week showed it marked as vacant, a blank line where a guest's name should have been. Yet here was a dead man in a bed that was supposed to be empty. The discrepancy was more than clerical error. It suggested that the man had either slipped into the hotel without being noticed, or that someone inside had allowed him entry off the books. The manager swore that no such arrangement had been made, but the officers could see the sweat beading on his forehead as he spoke. It was possible he feared a scandal more than the crime itself. For the Lincoln, reputation was survival. A single whiff of notoriety could drive away the wealthy clientele who filled its rooms. The policeman ordered the hall cleared and the door locked, but not before a few lingering guests caught sight of the corpse one last time. To them, the pale face and lifeless body became an image they would carry in whispers to friends and strangers alike. That night, over dinners in the dining hall and hushed conversations in the lobby, the story began to spread beyond the hotel walls. And as the corpse was examined more closely, the investigators found details that made the mystery darker still, marks on the body that hinted at violence. The body in room 104 offered almost nothing to investigators. He carried no wallet, no watch, no ring. Even his pockets, though not empty, contained nothing that could identify him. There were scraps of paper, torn edges filled with erratic handwriting, and a few coins of small value. Enough for a meal, perhaps a streetcar fare, but hardly what one expected from a man lodging at the Lincoln. Not a single card or letter carried his name. No monogrammed handkerchief. No tailor's mark on the inside of his suit. It was as though every thread of personal history had been deliberately stripped away before he entered the hotel. The lack of belongings unnerved the officers. In New York, even the poorest laborer carried something that spoke to his life. A pay stub, a family photograph, a pocket knife worn smooth from years of use. But this man had arrived in silence and anonymity. The chambermaids insisted they had never seen him before. The bellboys swore no luggage had been brought to his room. The desk clerks insisted he had not signed the register. The man had simply appeared, and now he was gone. Some of the staff began to whisper their own theories. One maid was convinced he was a criminal, hiding from justice until it finally caught up with him. A bellboy claimed he must have been smuggled in by someone on the inside, perhaps a guest who wanted privacy for a darker purpose. And the night clerk, though he said nothing aloud, wondered if the man had bribed another staff member to turn a blind eye. None of them dared to voice the most troubling suspicion, that one of their own had played a role in the man's death. The manager urged the police to remove the body quickly, fearful that gossip would poison the hotel's reputation. But the officers refused. Instead, they ordered the corpse left in place while a detective from the precinct was summoned. The room was sealed, the door locked once more, and guards posted in the hallway to keep curious guests at bay. But the sense of dread lingered. To the guests who had seen him, the man was already becoming a ghost story, the kind whispered to frighten children or traded over drinks in smoky bars. And for the police, the lack of identity was more than a curiosity. It was a problem. Without a name, they could not notify family, trace his movements, or even issue a proper report. The man in room 104 was not only dead. Officially, he had never existed. The detectives had the body carried from the hotel to the coroner's office under a shroud of secrecy. The carriage rolled through the streets of New York at dusk, its curtains drawn, while inside the Lincoln the chambermaid scrubbed and changed the sheets as if erasing the memory of room 104 could erase the horror itself. But no amount of polish could banish the whispers that followed. Guests lingered in the lobby, trading rumors, while the staff went about their duties with pale faces and trembling hands. All eyes turned toward the coroner's office for answers. When the first report arrived, it did little to quiet the unease. The examination revealed bruises scattered across the man's body, faint bands along his wrists, as though they had once been bound, smudges across the throat, not deep enough to suggest strangulation, but troubling all the same, and mottled patches along his ribs that spoke of some struggle, perhaps days before his death. None of these marks were decisive, but together they suggested that this man had not gone quietly. Something had pressed against him, restrained him, hurt him in some unrecorded confrontation. Then there was the matter of his lips and tongue. They were darkened, almost black at the edges, as if he had ingested some corrosive substance. The coroner suspected poison, though he could not identify the exact kind. Arsenic left its own trail, morphine another, cyanide yet another. But this residue was different, strange, resisting their crude chemical tests. A mixture, perhaps, or some rare preparation from outside the city. The whiskey bottle recovered from the nightstand was tested as well. It contained nothing unusual, though a bitter aftertaste clung to its rim. Had the poison been slipped into his drink, then removed by some careful hand? Or had he carried it with him, intending to end his own life? The coroner could not say. His report was filled with cautious phrases, possible ingestion of foreign substance, inconclusive signs of restraint, cause of death undetermined. The only certainty was uncertainty itself. For the police, the lack of clarity was maddening. A man without a name, without belongings, now without a clear cause of death. Each answer produced only more questions. The public wanted a story, suicide, murder, conspiracy, but the evidence gave them nothing solid. And yet, amid the confusion, one detail stood out. When the coroner emptied the man's pockets, he found the scraps of paper the police had noted earlier. Torn, scrawled, and cryptic, they bore phrases that chilled everyone who read them. Among them, one line repeated more than once, "Beware the Seventh Trumpet." When the detectives spread the scraps of paper across the coroner's desk, the room fell into a hush. They were not the sort of notes a businessman would carry, nor the careful records of a traveller. They were jagged, uneven, as if torn in haste from different pages, written in a cramped hand that shifted from one scrap to another as though the writer had been trembling. Some were in broken English, the grammar stilted and the words strangely chosen. Others were in German, the phrases clipped and severe, difficult even for translators to piece together. It was not only the language that disturbed the investigators, but the content itself. One scrap bore only a single line, written again and again until the ink bled through. "The hour is almost upon us." Another contained a fragment of scripture, Revelation 8:6, about the 7 angels who prepared to sound their trumpets. And then there was the line repeated on multiple slips, as if it had been an obsession, "Beware the 7th trumpet." The words seemed less like a warning and more like a prophecy, or perhaps a command. The coroner, unused to such riddles, set the papers aside with unease, but the detectives could not. Who carried such notes? A man preparing for suicide might leave a single letter of explanation, but not a handful of coded fragments. A spy might carry documents, but these were not instructions or maps. They were half-mad utterances, words that seemed to come from a fevered state of mind, or from a group steeped in ritual and secrecy. One officer wondered aloud if the man had been a preacher, some street-corner prophet who had stumbled into the Lincoln after years of railing against the coming apocalypse. Another suggested he was a foreign agent, the notes disguising orders behind the appearance of religious rambling. But the theories only deepened the mystery. The notes gave no name, no location, no clear intention. They were noise without context, a signal without a source. When news of their discovery leaked to the press, the city's imagination caught fire. The newspapers called him the Prophet of the Trumpet, while others preferred the mystery man of room 104. Crowds gathered outside the hotel, staring up at the windows as though expecting another message to flutter down from the sky. But for the detectives standing over the scraps of paper, the fascination was far from comforting. They could not escape the sense that the man's death was only the beginning of something larger, that whatever message he had carried, it was meant for someone still out there, someone who had not yet spoken. The morning after the discovery, the newspapers had their headlines ready. In bold type, they announced the baffling death at the Hotel Lincoln, embellishing details that the police had scarcely confirmed. "Mystery man found dead in room 104, one read, while another called him the stranger who warned of the 7th trumpet. Reporters who had never stepped foot in the hotel described the body in lurid detail, inventing embellishments to thrill their readers. Bloodied sheets, a knife hidden beneath the pillow, cries heard in the dead of night. None of these things were true, but the papers understood something more valuable than accuracy. Fear and fascination sold copies. By mid-morning, the Lincoln was surrounded by onlookers. Men in bowler hats and women clutching parasols pressed against the hotel's entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous room or the detectives who shuffled in and out. Street vendors seized the opportunity, hawking broadsheets with every fresh rumor, their cries echoing down the avenues. The trumpet prophet, the poisoned stranger, secrets from beyond the grave. For the police, the sudden blaze of publicity was a curse. Where they had hoped to conduct a discreet investigation, they now faced a public spectacle. The more the press invented, the less control the detectives had over the narrative. Reporters demanded interviews with the chambermaids, the bellboys, the clerks, anyone who might offer a scrap of new detail. The staff, frightened of losing their jobs, either refused to speak or spun tales of their own, adding to the confusion. What most troubled investigators was the effect the coverage had on the scraps of paper. Instead of being treated as clues, they became objects of myth. Readers speculated wildly about their meaning. Some insisted the man was part of a secret sect predicting the end of the world. Others were certain he was a spy who had stumbled into an assassination plot. Still others whispered that the notes were part of a curse, and that the Lincoln itself was now haunted by the restless soul of the dead man. Each new theory made the truth harder to grasp. The notes, the bruises, the absence of identity, all became pieces in a puzzle that no one could solve, but everyone wanted to claim. The press had christened him, and in doing so had given him a kind of immortality. The corpse in room 104 was no longer a man without a name. He was a symbol of something darker, something uncanny, something the city itself could not look away from. Within days, the Hotel Lincoln was no longer simply a place of lodging. It had become a spectacle, an attraction as compelling to some as the theaters on Broadway or the wax figures in Barnum's museum once had been. Curious onlookers crowded the sidewalks, craning their necks toward the windows as if the ghostly figure of the dead man might appear there to answer their questions. Inside, guests who had paid handsomely for quiet and discretion now found themselves in the midst of chaos. Some demanded to be moved to different rooms, fearing that death lingered in the walls. Others, with a morbid thrill, asked to be placed as close to room 104 as possible, as though proximity to tragedy carried a strange sort of glamour. The staff struggled to maintain composure, but the truth was clear on their faces. The chambermaids whispered to one another in the laundry room, insisting that they heard strange sounds when passing the locked door. The bellboys passed along more sensational tales to eager listeners, embellishing details of the corpse with each telling. Soon the whispers had hardened into folklore. The man's eyes had been wide open. He had clutched the sheets, as if resisting some unseen force. His final words had been scratched into the wall in blood. None of these things were true, yet by the time the stories reached the ears of the public, they carried the weight of fact. Reporters lingered in the lobby, bribing staff for morsels of gossip, while rival newspapers accused one another of fabricating details. The Lincoln's reputation began to teeter. What had once been an emblem of refinement was fast becoming a carnival of the macabre. Wealthier patrons cancelled their reservations, while the curious poor came in droves just to stand outside and say they had seen the place where the trumpet prophet met his end. And all the while, the police investigation faltered. Every attempt at privacy was thwarted by the crush of spectators, every clue drowned beneath a flood of rumour. Even the coroner's inconclusive findings became a subject of derision in the press, painted as proof of official incompetence, or worse, deliberate concealment. By the end of the week, the dead man had become more than a mystery. He had become an obsession. His nameless face stared from illustrated papers. His cryptic warnings filled conversations in saloons and drawing rooms alike. And in the streets outside the Lincoln, the crowd grew restless, as though waiting for the next act of a drama that was not yet finished. It was inevitable that the story would grow larger than the walls of the Lincoln Hotel. In a city that thrived on rumor and intrigue, the absence of facts only encouraged imagination. Soon, the papers no longer described the dead man as a lonely wanderer or a mad prophet. They called him something more dangerous, a spy. The word carried weight in 1910. Across Europe, alliances strained under quiet suspicion, and New York, with its docks, banks, and shipping lanes, was a fertile ground for clandestine activity. If a man could die nameless in a hotel room, perhaps it was because he had been part of a game too secret for ordinary citizens to understand. Columnists speculated about his German notes, drawing connections between his scraps of language and the growing tensions between empires. Some insisted the man was an agent of Berlin, sent to deliver messages about naval expansion. Others countered that he was an English spy, shadowing German contacts in America's busiest port. A few suggested an even darker possibility, that he was not a European at all, but a defector from a secretive cult, silenced before he could reveal its plans. The police, already floundering, found themselves pressured to investigate every lead. Detectives visited German-language newspapers, questioned pastors at immigrant churches, even interrogated waiters in taverns where foreigners gathered. Each inquiry ended in nothing more than speculation. No one recognized the dead man. No one claimed him as a comrade or kin. Still, the story of espionage grew legs of its own. New Yorkers were eager to believe that they stood at the edge of a shadow war, that the corpse in room 104 was a casualty of forces far larger than themselves. It was a narrative that gave the nameless stranger purpose, transforming him from a victim of chance into a player in international intrigue. And yet, for the detectives who sat night after night in the precinct, staring at the scraps of paper and the inconclusive coroner's report, the theory brought little comfort. The notes spoke of trumpets and prophecy, not troop movements or codes. The bruises hinted at violence, but not at the professional efficiency of an assassin. If he was a spy, he was a peculiar one. Too careless to cover his tracks, too strange in his writings to be mistaken for a man of discipline. It left the investigators suspended between two possibilities: that he was a prophet mistaken for a spy, or a spy hiding beneath the guise of prophecy. And until someone stepped forward with the truth, the corpse in room 104 would remain both, and neither. Not long after the papers began printing stories of espionage and prophecy, the police precinct handling the case received the first of what would become a series of anonymous letters. It arrived in an unremarkable envelope, with no return address, the handwriting jagged and uneven. Inside, a single sheet carried the words, "Do not disturb what was meant to remain hidden." There was no signature, no clue to its sender. At first, the detectives dismissed it as a crank note, the sort of nonsense stirred up whenever a case captured the public's imagination. But a week later, a second arrived, then a third. The second letter was longer, its tone colder, more threatening. It warned the investigators to stop searching, to leave the matter of room 104 alone. "He was chosen," it read. "His purpose is finished. If you dig further, the same fate awaits you." The officers who read it exchanged uneasy glances. Idle threats were nothing new in the precinct, but there was something unsettling about the certainty with which the letter had been written, as if the author truly believed in some hidden order directing events. The third letter was worse still. It mentioned details that had never been published in the papers: the bruises on the man's wrists, the German phrases scattered among his notes. Someone knew far more than the average crank. Someone had either been close to the dead man or close enough to the investigation to learn what should have been private. The detectives tried to trace the letters, but the envelopes were always the same: plain, common, handled too many times to yield usable fingerprints. Postmarks shifted from one borough to another as though the sender moved constantly or deliberately sought to obscure their trail. With each new delivery, the unease in the precinct deepened. Some officers insisted the letters were the work of pranksters, perhaps rival reporters hoping to keep the story alive. But others, especially those who had seen the corpse up close, were not so certain. For the men who carried the case, the warnings took on the weight of prophecy. They began to speak more softly about room 104, lowering their voices as if unseen ears might be listening. Some joked uneasily about refusing night shifts, not wanting to walk home alone through the shadowed streets. And when another letter arrived, this time containing only 2 words scrawled in black ink, "Seventh Trumpet," the case took on a darker edge, as though the corpse had reached out from the grave to remind them the story was far from over. The phrase "Seventh Trumpet" clung to the investigation like a curse. It appeared in the notes pulled from the man's pockets, it repeated in the anonymous warnings, and now it lingered in the minds of every detective assigned to the case. At first, they assumed it was a biblical reference and nothing more, another sign of a disturbed mind drifting into prophecy. But when one officer consulted a local pastor, he was told that the seventh trumpet was no idle phrase. In the book of Revelation, it heralded the final judgment, the unleashing of destruction before the end of days. To carry such a phrase repeatedly suggested obsession or initiation into a group that lived by those words. That hint was enough to send investigators combing through the city's underbelly. New York was a place where societies, fraternal orders, and religious sects thrived in shadow. There were temperance clubs that met in secret, lodges with rituals known only to members, revivalist groups that thundered about fire and brimstone in rented halls. In that noisy mix, the police began to hear whispers of something darker, a congregation that called itself the Order of the Seventh Trumpet. It was not a formal church, nor a recognized denomination. According to scattered accounts, it was a secretive circle of believers who preached that the world stood on the edge of collapse, that the final trumpet was soon to sound. They met irregularly, often changing venues, gathering in basements and abandoned warehouses where hymns mingled with whispered oaths. Some said they were harmless zealots, another fringe group among many. Others claimed they practiced strange rites, sealing their members with marks and binding them to silence with threats. The detectives had no solid evidence connecting the dead man to this shadowy sect. But the scraps of scripture in his pockets the obsessive warnings, and now the anonymous letters all pointed in the same direction. Was he a member abandoned by his brethren? A messenger silenced before he could reveal their secrets? Or an outcast whose death was meant to serve as an example to others? The press, catching scent of the theory, pounced on it. Headlines proclaimed, "Secret cult behind mystery man," and columnists speculated about dark rituals unfolding beneath the city's very streets. The police tried to temper the frenzy, but privately they admitted the possibility unnerved them. For if the order was real, then the man in room 104 had not died alone. He had been part of something larger, something that might still be watching. As the weeks passed, the story of room 104 refused to fade. Instead, it seemed to ripple outward, touching places far beyond the Lincoln's grand facade. Other hotels began to report strange incidents. Some whispered quietly to police, others shouted through the press by managers desperate for attention. At a boarding house in Brooklyn, a lodger vanished without paying his rent, leaving behind only a torn scrap of paper scrawled with phrases from the Book of Revelation. In a shabby inn near the East River docks, a traveller checked in under a false name and disappeared overnight, his bed unslept, his trunk empty except for a small slip of paper that read, "The trumpet has sounded once." Each case on its own could be explained: careless tenants, ordinary theft, religious fanatics with too much time on their hands. But together, the pattern was harder to ignore. The same fragments of scripture, the same obsession with trumpets, prophecy, and endings. It was as though the nameless corpse in room 104 had been only one of many, a single note in a chorus of shadows spreading across the city. Detectives visited these establishments, comparing the scraps of writing with those taken from the pockets of the dead man. The handwriting varied, but the content was eerily similar. Sometimes the verses were written in English, sometimes in German, occasionally in a blend of the two. And always, always, there was a warning, not to the reader, but to the world. A trumpet was coming. Judgment was near. Rumors spread quickly among the city's citizens. Some believed that a cult had infiltrated New York's hotels, using them as temporary shelters before vanishing into the night. Others thought it was the work of a secret society that recruited from the city's immigrant communities, passing coded messages through scraps of scripture. And for those inclined toward the supernatural, there was only one explanation. The ghost of the man from room 104 had multiplied, haunting other lodgings, leaving warnings in his wake. For the police, the new cases brought no answers, only more confusion. The city was too vast, the stories too scattered, the evidence too ephemeral. A dead man here, a vanished lodger there, a scrap of paper fluttering in a gutter. Each piece on its own was nothing, yet together they suggested a story unfolding just beyond sight, one that the officers could neither prove nor deny. And the more they investigated, the more it seemed the mystery was no longer confined to a single room in the Lincoln. It had spread quietly across the city itself. As detectives pinned reports to the precinct's corkboard, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Each incident seemed trivial on its own. A missing tenant, a half-empty room, a scrap of paper left behind. But when the threads were pulled together, the pattern was undeniable. In the space of a month, at least 5 other bodies had been discovered across the city under strange circumstances. Some were found in rented rooms, others in lodging houses near the docks. None carried clear identification. And in every case, there was a common thread: cryptic notes mentioning trumpets, judgment, or the nearing of an hour. One man, found in a flophouse on the Bowery, had died with a folded sheet beneath his pillow. On it were the words, "6 have sounded, 1 remains." Another, discovered in a cheap hotel in Jersey City, had been reduced almost to a skeleton by the time police arrived. His clothing bore no labels, and in his breast pocket was a single card with the words, "The hour of silence will be broken." The handwriting was not identical to the room 104 scraps, yet the phrasing echoed the same obsessions, the same apocalyptic tone. Even more unsettling were the bodies that no one claimed. Morgues reported an uptick in unclaimed corpses, men without names or families, carried to Hart Island for burial in mass graves. Each, in some small way, carried echoes of the mystery at the Lincoln: missing records, odd bruises, or fragments of scripture tucked into their clothing. The city, already filled with the forgotten poor, now seemed to be swallowing men whole, men who lived without trace and died without explanation. The detectives struggled to decide what they were dealing with. Was this a series of suicides carried out by men gripped with the same religious mania? Or was there, lurking in the shadows, an organization eliminating its own, leaving cryptic fragments as warnings or rituals? Some in the precinct scoffed at the idea of a cult, dismissing it as hysteria fanned by the newspapers, but others could not ignore the rhythm of it. One body after another, each tethered to the same language of trumpets and endings, each vanishing from ordinary life into a death no one could explain. The corpse in room 104 had once seemed singular, a puzzle that stood alone. Now it was part of something larger, a dark pattern woven through the city's streets. And with each discovery, the investigators felt themselves pulled deeper into a story that refused to let them go. The detectives returned often to the Lincoln, not only to re-examine the room, but also to question the staff again and again. Each visit yielded more than just recollections. It brought out confessions of unease that the employees had tried at first to suppress. The chambermaids, who had been instructed to say nothing to guests, whispered nervously among themselves in the laundry room. One claimed she had passed by room 104 late at night, days before the discovery, and heard muffled voices inside. Yet no one had ever been seen entering or leaving. Another swore she had noticed the faint glow of a lamp burning under the door long after the gas lights in the hall had been extinguished. The bellboys, young men eager to make their wages, carried their own stories. One admitted he had been bribed with a coin to deliver a sealed envelope to the door of room 104. When he knocked, no one answered, but the envelope vanished hours later when he passed by again. Another boy recalled seeing two men loitering in the hallway outside the room, dressed in dark coats despite the summer heat. When asked to describe them, he faltered, insisting their faces were shadowed, indistinct, as though memory itself resisted clarity. The night clerk, pale and jittery, told detectives he had been approached by a man asking about room 104 several days before the body was found. The stranger's voice had been low, his questions precise. Was the room occupied? Could he be given a key without signing the register? The clerk refused, but days later the dead man appeared upstairs as if the refusal had meant nothing. When pressed to describe this visitor, the clerk hesitated, finally admitting he could not recall the man's features. It was as if his face had slipped from memory the moment he turned away. Whether these recollections were truth or invention, they spread quickly among the staff. Soon, the Lincoln was haunted not only by the memory of the corpse, but by stories of shadowed visitors, whispered voices, and unseen hands. Guests overheard these tales in passing and carried them back to their parlors and clubs, weaving them into a legend that grew darker with every telling. And perhaps the most disturbing rumor of all came from one maid who claimed that after the body had been removed, she entered the room to change the linens and felt a presence there, something cold, watching, as if the occupant had not truly left. Weeks after the discovery, when the Lincoln's manager was finally persuaded to hand over older records to detectives, something peculiar emerged. The hotel's guest ledgers were usually meticulous, pages of names, addresses, dates of arrival and departure, all carefully logged in the clerk's neat script. Yet one book, dating from a fortnight before the body was found, contained an entry that made the detectives pause. The writing was not the careful, flowing penmanship of most travellers. It was hurried, jagged, slanted across the page as though written by a trembling hand. The name given was Johann Schmidt, a common German surname, almost too common, and the address listed was a vacant lot on the Lower East Side. When investigators compared the handwriting to the scraps of paper pulled from the dead man's pockets, they found striking similarities, the same sharp angles, the same uneven pressure of the pen. It was not proof, but it was close enough to raise suspicion that the corpse in room 104 might have signed into the hotel once before under a false name, then vanished until his return. The entry gave detectives a fragile thread to tug. They searched the supposed address, only to find rubble and stray cats prowling through weeds. No neighbor had ever heard of a Johann Schmidt living nearby. The name itself was an evasive gesture, a mask meant to obscure rather than reveal. But why leave behind such a record at all? Why appear once in the ledger, then never again? Some detectives believed the entry was deliberate, a breadcrumb left for those who might search after his death. Others thought it was a mistake, a slip of a man trying to hide who he was, but failing to cover his tracks completely. And there were those who whispered of a darker explanation, that he had been part of a revolving chain of nameless men, each using the same false identity, each destined to vanish in turn. When the press got wind of the discovery, they published the name in bold letters. Johann Schmidt, they declared, the ghost guest of the Lincoln. Readers were told he was a foreigner, living under assumed names, a spy, a cultist, or perhaps something less human altogether. The public didn't care about the truth of the entry. What mattered was the sense of pattern, that the man in room 104 had left a mark, however faint, that could be traced. For the police, however, the entry was less reassuring. It did not answer the question of who he was. Instead, it confirmed the most troubling suspicion of all. The man had not appeared at the Lincoln by accident. He had returned, and the room had been waiting for him. The coroner's office was not eager to reopen its findings, but public pressure and the persistence of detectives forced the matter. The body of the man from room 104 had been preserved longer than most, held in a cold vault while the city argued over his identity. When the autopsy report was revisited in greater detail, new inconsistencies emerged. The bruises noted in the first examination seemed more deliberate upon second review. The faint bands around his wrists were not merely the marks of a fall or accidental pressure. They were consistent with rope or leather straps, the kind used to restrain someone who did not wish to be held. The mottling along his ribs suggested repeated blows, shallow but intentional, as though designed not to kill but to weaken. His throat bore the shadow of hands, not a rope. Bruises spread unevenly, the ghost of a struggle that had been fierce but incomplete. Then there was the matter of his stomach contents. When analyzed again, traces of a substance were found that defied easy identification. It was neither arsenic nor morphine nor cyanide, the usual weapons of suicide or quiet murder. Instead, it bore resemblance to an alkaloid derived from certain exotic plants, substances used in South America and parts of Asia, but almost unknown in New York. The coroner speculated that it could have been mixed into a liquid, bitter enough to stain the lips but subtle enough to confuse detection. Whether it had been forced upon him or taken willingly remained uncertain. The combination of physical restraint and poison raised troubling questions. If he had been tied, beaten, and forced to drink, then his death was murder. But if he had been restrained as part of some ritual, weakened, and then given the poison as a sacrament, then the boundaries between crime and ceremony blurred into something darker. The police clung to the first explanation. It was easier to imagine a murderer than to accept the possibility of a secret order carrying out rites in the heart of the city. The findings did not bring closure. They only sharpened the unease. The man had not died peacefully, nor had he chosen an ordinary suicide. He had been pushed toward death by forces still unseen, bound by hands unknown, poisoned by a substance no one could name. And in the silence of the morgue, his body seemed less like a victim and more like a message, a warning written not in ink but in flesh. The scraps of paper recovered from the dead man's pockets were translated more carefully now, their German phrases placed under the eye of both scholars and detectives. Some were simple enough, fragments of scripture copied from the Lutheran Bible, familiar to any churchgoer. But others were stranger, written in clipped coded turns of phrase that resisted easy meaning. One fragment read, Die Stunde kommt, und das Zeichen wird nicht verfehlen. The hour comes, and the sign will not fail. Another warned, Schweigen ist der Schlüssel. Silence is the key. These were not the mutterings of a man in casual study. They read like mantras, memorized instructions, or even oaths. The German connection carried weight in a city already anxious about foreigners. Immigration had brought thousands from Europe into New York, and though many worked as laborers, craftsmen, or clerks, suspicion clung to them in certain circles. Newspapers eager to sell copies painted the mystery as an international plot. "German agent dead in hotel," blared one headline. Others went further, suggesting that the Order of the Seventh Trumpet was not a religious cult at all, but a cover for espionage, its coded scraps a disguise for secret instructions passed between agents. Detectives followed the lead through immigrant neighborhoods, visiting beer halls and Lutheran congregations, questioning anyone who might have recognized the phrases. A few elderly men remembered hearing similar words whispered among secretive gatherings in rented basements, where hymns and prayers mixed with warnings of judgment to come. But when pressed, no one admitted to knowing the dead man. He was a ghost even among those who seemed closest to his language. Some detectives argued that the man might have been German himself, a zealot or dissenter who fell in with dangerous company. Others suggested he was not German at all, but had carried the words as a mask, a deliberate disguise meant to sow suspicion. The ambiguity itself was troubling. If he had been German, his death carried political weight. If he had only borrowed the language, then the riddle was even deeper, a deliberate attempt to mislead. Theories multiplied faster than evidence. Some said he was a failed courier, silenced for losing the message he carried. Others claimed he was an infiltrator, caught and executed by the very order he sought to expose. But as the detectives sifted through speculation, one fact remained undeniable. The notes, the bruises, the poison all pointed not to an accident, but to intent. Someone had wanted him silenced, and the German words, whether genuine or borrowed, were not random. They were a trail left behind for someone to follow, or perhaps to fear. As the detectives wrestled with theories of espionage and foreign intrigue, others began to point toward something older, more familiar, and perhaps more dangerous: religion. The scraps of scripture were not random passages plucked from a Bible. They were all drawn from the Book of Revelation, the most apocalyptic of texts, a vision of trumpets, plagues, angels, and the end of days. To those who studied the verses carefully, a pattern emerged. The notes seemed to fixate on the seventh trumpet, the moment when heaven opened and voices declared that time had ended. It was not simply a line of scripture, it was an obsession. Clergy consulted by the press offered competing views. Some dismissed the writings as the fevered ravings of a lunatic, a man driven mad by isolation or guilt. Others, however, recognized echoes of sects that had flourished in Europe and America alike, small, fervent groups that saw in Revelation not metaphor, but a timetable for destruction. These groups often gathered in secrecy, bound by oaths, awaiting the trumpet that would usher in judgment. The language on the scraps carried the same tone, the same chilling certainty that the world was on the brink of collapse. The idea of a cult began to take hold. Reporters described meetings in shadowed basements where candlelight flickered across makeshift altars, where sermons whispered of a seventh angel preparing to sound. Detectives could find no proof of such gatherings, yet the rumors persisted, fed by anonymous letters and whispered testimony from frightened citizens. The Order of the Seventh Trumpet, once a mere phrase, was now spoken as though it were a living presence in the city, unseen yet everywhere. For the police, the religious angle complicated matters further. If the man in room 104 was a zealot, perhaps his death was voluntary, a ritual sacrifice or suicide offered as part of a larger creed. But the bruises on his wrists, the poison in his blood, and the threats that arrived in the mail suggested something darker, that he had been silenced by his own brethren for reasons known only to them. Was he a prophet cut down before he could reveal too much, or a failed disciple punished for betrayal? The more investigators leaned into the possibility of cult activity, the less the case resembled ordinary crime. Murder could be solved with motive and evidence. But if the man's death was bound to prophecy and belief, then motive itself dissolved into shadows, leaving behind only fear and the sense that the end he had written about was not his alone. When no family stepped forward to claim the corpse, the city followed its usual procedure. The body, unclaimed and unresolved, was consigned to Hart Island, the potter's field where the forgotten of New York were laid to rest. Carriages carried him away in silence, past neighborhoods teeming with life, to the lonely strip of land in the Bronx waters where rows of pine coffins were stacked in trenches, each marked only by a number. There, labourers lowered him into the earth beside paupers, orphans, and the nameless dead who had no one left to speak for them. For most, Hart Island was the final end, a place where identities dissolved, where memory itself was swallowed by the soil. But even here, the story of room 104 refused to rest. Dockworkers claimed that on the morning of his burial, strangers watched from the shoreline. 3 men in long coats stood apart from the crowd, silent and stiff, their hats pulled low. They did not follow the cart into the burial ground. They remained by the water's edge until the earth was filled in, then turned and vanished without a word. No one knew who they were or why they had chosen to watch a pauper's burial of a man no one else seemed to want. Others whispered that they had seen candles burning on Hart Island that night, faint flickers among the graves where no caretaker was meant to tread after dark. The rumours spread quickly, fanned by the newspapers eager to keep the story alive. "Secret mourners for Mystery Man," declared one headline. Was he a prophet or a martyr? Detectives tried to separate fact from invention, but each inquiry ended in silence. The dockworkers could not describe the strangers clearly. The supposed candles left no trace, and yet the persistence of these tales troubled the police. If the man truly belonged to a sect, perhaps his brethren had followed his body to its resting place, ensuring that even in anonymity he was not forgotten. Or perhaps those men were something else entirely, watchers ensuring that his silence would remain undisturbed. For the city, the burial did nothing to quiet fascination. If anything, the anonymity of Hart Island only heightened the unease. New Yorkers were left to imagine the body of the trumpet prophet lying nameless among thousands of others, his secrets buried but not gone. Death had closed the door on his life, but the whispers that clung to him suggested the story was not finished. And when new letters began to arrive, carrying the same chilling warnings, it seemed the grave had failed to contain him. Months passed, and for a time it seemed the mystery of room 104 might finally fade into silence. Other scandals filled the papers, new crimes claimed the attention of the public, and the Lincoln did its best to scrub its reputation clean. But just as the city began to forget, the letters returned, this time from far beyond New York. The first surfaced in Philadelphia, delivered to a police station with no signature, no explanation. It was brief, written in the same jagged hand as those received in Manhattan. "The Seventh Trumpet has not yet sounded. He was only the beginning." Days later, a similar letter arrived in Boston, then another in Baltimore. Each carried the same obsession, the same warnings of an hour approaching, but none gave names or dates. They were fragments, whispers torn from some larger message that remained just out of reach. The discovery unsettled New York detectives, who now faced the possibility that the dead man had not been alone in his mania. If these letters were genuine, then the ideas he carried in his pockets were alive and moving through other cities. The notion of a cult confined to one lodging house or a single hotel room crumbled. This was something larger, something mobile, something that could vanish from New York only to appear again in Philadelphia or Boston like a ghost crossing state lines. The newspapers seized on the letters with predictable relish. "Trumpet order spreads east," one headline proclaimed. "Mystery man's followers still at large." Reporters speculated wildly about secret networks, claiming that the man buried on Hart Island had been a martyr to a cause that still lingered in the shadows. Some swore the letters proved an underground society bound by prophecy and silence, while skeptics dismissed them as the work of pranksters inspired by the original story. For detectives, the letters were more troubling than theatrical. If pranksters, they were unusually persistent. If genuine, then the Order of the Seventh Trumpet, or whatever name it went by, was not a phantom but a network with reach far beyond New York. And if that were true, the dead man in room 104 was not simply an unsolved case. He was evidence of something that stretched across cities, perhaps across the entire coast. The case, which many had hoped would fade into obscurity, had found new life. The trumpet had not been silenced. It was spreading. The resurgence of the letters drew the attention of a new kind of investigator, not the police, but the press. Hungry reporters began to look beyond the Hotel Lincoln, beyond even New York, chasing the echoes of the mystery wherever they could find them. What they uncovered was not a single case, but a scattered trail of deaths and disappearances stretching across the Northeast. One journalist from the New York Herald traced a report from Newark about a man found dead in a boarding house with no identification and a fragment of paper tucked into his shoe. On it were the words, "The silence before the trumpet is brief." Another paper, the Boston Globe, published an account of a drifter who collapsed in a church vestibule and died before giving his name. In his coat pocket, police discovered a note written in shaky German. Die siebte Posaune wartet. The seventh trumpet waits. The more reporters searched, the more patterns they found. In Philadelphia, a body pulled from the river carried no wallet, only a torn hymn book with Revelation underlined in heavy strokes. In Baltimore, a transient was discovered with his arms marked by faint bruises, as if bound, and in his hand a scrap reading simply, "Soon." Each case was small, easily overlooked on its own, but together they began to mirror the story of Room 104 too closely to ignore. Newspapers competed to outdo one another, piecing these fragments into lurid narratives. Some declared that the Order of the Seventh Trumpet was a vast underground brotherhood, sacrificing members who faltered. Others claimed it was less a society than an infection, a madness spreading through vagrants and strangers who passed the obsession from one to another like a fever. Illustrations filled the papers, dark-robed figures blowing trumpets over city skylines, sinister hands passing slips of paper in shadowed alleys. The public devoured it, and with each new story, the dead man in room 104 gained new significance. He was no longer just a nameless corpse in a hotel bed. He was cast as a harbinger, the first visible crack in a hidden structure stretching far beyond New York. Theories clashed in saloons, in church basements, in parlors where respectable families whispered over the evening paper. Was the order real, a secret cult threading through American cities, or was it nothing more than the collective madness of a public desperate to impose meaning on coincidence? For the detectives still assigned to the original case, the press made their work harder. Facts were buried beneath speculation, details warped by exaggeration. Yet beneath all the noise, one truth gnawed at them. The further they looked, the less isolated the corpse in room 104 appeared. He was part of a chain, and if there was a chain, someone had forged it. By the autumn of 1910, the case of room 104 had shifted from a single enigma into a contagion of fear. What had begun as the story of one nameless corpse now echoed in parlors, factories, and taverns across the city. Ordinary people, many of whom had never set foot near the Lincoln, began to claim that they too were being watched, followed by strangers whose faces they could never quite remember. Letters to the editor poured into the newspapers, long, rambling accounts of men in dark coats loitering near doorsteps, of scraps of paper slipped beneath doors bearing fragments of scripture, of whispered voices overheard in alleyways. Most of these claims were impossible to prove, but the sheer volume unsettled the authorities. The police received dozens of reports from citizens convinced that their lives were in danger from shadowy members of the so-called order. Some swore they had been handed folded slips of paper by beggars in the street, each inscribed with words about trumpets or judgment. Others insisted that strangers had shadowed them through crowds, vanishing when confronted. A few claimed to have seen gatherings at night in abandoned warehouses, where figures stood in circles and recited verses in low voices. It was impossible to separate truth from hysteria. Some of the stories were clearly inventions, born of fear and newspaper sensationalism. Yet others carried details too specific to dismiss. Detectives themselves admitted, off the record, that they had been trailed more than once while investigating the case, always by figures who seemed to melt into the city the moment pursuit began. The paranoia spread beyond the streets into households. Families warned their children not to speak to strangers. Landlords grew suspicious of tenants who paid in cash and left no forwarding address. Preachers railed against secret societies from their pulpits, warning that the devil himself might be walking in their midst, disguised as prophets of doom. And through it all, the memory of the man in room 104 lingered, his nameless face invoked as both warning and proof. For some, the fear was intoxicating. Amateur sleuths prowled the streets, hoping to glimpse the order for themselves, treating it as a grim adventure. For others, the tension was unbearable, the sense that unseen forces threaded through the city like wires beneath the cobblestones. And for the detectives, already overwhelmed, it was a nightmare, because whether the order was real or not, the city now believed in it, and belief, they knew, could be as dangerous as truth. By winter, the investigation into the corpse of room 104 had slowed to a crawl. The detectives who had once pored over scraps of paper and interviewed frightened witnesses now found their resources pulled in other directions. New crimes demanded attention: robberies, murders, labor riots, and the city's appetite for the mystery seemed, at least in official channels, to have waned. Reports still trickled in from other hotels and boarding houses, but each was harder to verify, each swallowed by the daily grind of urban life. To the police, the case was fast becoming what they dreaded most: a curiosity without resolution. The file was thick with contradictions. The autopsy suggested both restraint and poison, yet gave no name for the substance. The scraps of notes pointed toward prophecy, yet were written in a hand that hinted at espionage. The bruises spoke of violence, but not enough to tell if it was ritual or murder. And above all, the dead man remained without a name, without a past, as though he had been conjured into being solely to die in room 104. The precinct's frustration hardened into silence. The lead detective, weary of chasing phantoms, finally admitted to reporters that the matter may never be resolved. With that pronouncement, the story seemed to lose its official standing. The corpse became a file to be stored, an unanswered question placed on the shelf among many others. Hart Island had claimed the man's body, and now bureaucracy seemed ready to bury his case as well. But while the police lost interest, the public did not. In taverns, people still repeated the tale of the stranger with prophecy in his pockets. In church basements, whispers of cult activity lingered. The newspapers, though moving on to fresher scandals, still returned to the case on slow news days, publishing retrospective pieces with headlines like "The Prophet of the Trumpet," "Forgotten or Feared." Each retelling twisted the story further, stripping it of fact and layering it with legend until even those who had followed it closely could no longer separate truth from embellishment. For the families of New York, the case became a cautionary tale told at bedtime. Beware the stranger. Beware the room left unguarded. Beware the man who speaks of trumpets in the night. And for the detectives who had lived with the corpse, it remained an itch at the back of the mind. Officially, the case had gone cold, but unofficially, they knew something still lingered, something unresolved, something waiting in the silence. Time has a way of reshaping tragedy into legend, and the nameless corpse of room 104 was no exception. With the police withdrawing from the case and the newspapers moving on to fresher scandals, the story did not die. It changed. Among the citizens of New York, the tale began to drift from fact into something darker and more malleable. It became a story retold in taverns and boarding houses, embellished around dinner tables and whispered in the hushed corridors of other hotels. The man without a name, once a puzzle for detectives, became a spectre for the imagination. Some said that his ghost lingered in the halls of the Lincoln, appearing at night to chambermaids carrying fresh linens. Others swore that guests who stayed in room 104 after the death heard footsteps pacing inside even when the room was locked. The staff themselves did little to discourage such tales. For them, the memory of the body, the bruises, and the scraps of paper was too raw, too real to dismiss. They whispered that the man's prophecy had bound him to the room, that he could not leave until the seventh trumpet finally sounded. Children heard the story from their elders, who exaggerated its details to keep them from wandering the streets at night. In these retellings, the corpse was no longer simply a man. He became a warning figure, a cautionary spirit who punished liars, cheats, or those who dared to mock the holy scriptures. On Hart Island, where the paupers lay buried, rumors spread of a trench where strange noises were heard at dusk, as though the nameless man still tried to speak from beneath the soil. The legend traveled quickly beyond New York. Sailors carried it to Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, telling of the prophet who had died in a grand hotel, his pockets full of judgment. In each city, the story took on new colors. Sometimes he was a spy, sometimes a cultist, sometimes a preacher struck down by divine punishment. The facts blurred, but the power of the tale only grew. By the time a decade had passed, the corpse of room 104 had ceased to be a case file and become something more enduring, a piece of folklore. He was no longer a nameless man. He was the trumpet prophet, the ghost of room 104, a story retold whenever the air grew heavy and silence seemed too deep. And like all legends, his truth no longer mattered. What remained was the fear he left behind. Decades passed, and the story of the nameless corpse in room 104 lived on in whispers and folklore. By the mid-20th century, it had become the sort of tale that local historians stumbled upon in yellowed newspapers, a curiosity more than a crime. Yet every so often, the case would attract fresh attention as scholars, journalists, or amateur sleuths tried to unravel the layers of myth that time had draped over the truth. In the 1950s, a historian of New York crime included the case in a book of unsolved mysteries, reprinting the original headlines and noting how quickly fact had given way to rumor. In the 1970s, a graduate student wrote a thesis on Hart Island and stumbled upon burial records that included a line for the unidentified man reduced to a number among thousands. In the 1990s, true crime enthusiasts began to circulate the story in small newsletters, pairing it with other tales of forgotten corpses and secret societies. What struck modern researchers most was not how much had been remembered, but how much had been lost. The official police files had long since vanished, likely discarded as irrelevant. The autopsy report survived only in fragments, quoted in newspapers. Even the scraps of paper, the supposed heart of the mystery, were nowhere to be found. Had they been destroyed, locked in some archive, or had they slipped into private hands, hidden away by someone who understood their significance? The absence of hard evidence left modern investigators with speculation. Some leaned toward rational explanations. Perhaps the man had been a transient suffering from religious mania, his death merely a tragic accident compounded by the city's appetite for drama. Others, however, believed the cult angle held weight. They pointed to the recurring notes about the Seventh Trumpet, the rumors of gatherings in basements, the persistence of letters in multiple cities. Could all of that have been invention, or was there indeed a shadowy order that left its mark across the Northeast before fading into obscurity? In recent years, the story has gained renewed life in the age of digital archives and online forums. Amateur detectives pore over old clippings, tracing names and postmarks, piecing together timelines. Conspiracy theorists argue that the man was silenced for uncovering secrets too dangerous to speak. Paranormal enthusiasts insist his spirit still haunts Hart Island, his prophecy unfinished. For every investigator who tries to strip the legend down to fact, there are countless more who cling to the mystery. In the absence of answers, the story continues to breathe, not in courtrooms or morgues, but in the minds of those who cannot let room 104 rest. Over the years, the corpse of room 104 has attracted no shortage of theories. Each one promises to solve the riddle, yet none can fully account for all the details. The simplest explanation has always been suicide. According to this theory, the man was a drifter gripped by religious mania, scribbling his apocalyptic notes before taking poison in solitude. His bruises, proponents argue, could have been caused by falls or convulsions, his lack of belongings, the mark of a transient who carried nothing worth keeping. It is a clean solution, except for the letters that arrived afterward, too detailed and too persistent to be dismissed as coincidence. Others believe he was a spy caught in the shifting tides of international politics. The German phrases, the false entry in the hotel ledger, the mysterious strangers rumoured to linger near his burial, all seem to fit a narrative of espionage gone wrong. Perhaps he was silenced by his own allies after a failed mission, or eliminated by rivals before he could deliver his message. Yet the religious imagery and prophetic warnings clash with the cold logic of espionage, leaving the theory elegant but incomplete. Then there is the cult hypothesis, one that refuses to die. To many, the order of the Seventh Trumpet was no myth. The repeated notes, the anonymous letters, the reports of similar deaths across the Northeast all point to a network bound together by prophecy. Some researchers suggest that the man was a disciple who faltered in his faith and was punished for betrayal. Others imagine him as a prophet whose words threatened the order itself, silenced before he could reveal too much. The bruises, the poison, the secrecy, all fit neatly into the shape of ritual. Still more speculative voices paint him as something larger than life, a martyr, a victim of secret societies, even a figure cursed to wander until his prophecy was fulfilled. These theories live less in history and more in folklore, but they persist because the case invites them. Without a name, without closure, the corpse of room 104 becomes whatever story the listener needs it to be: madman, spy, prophet, or ghost. In the end, none of the theories can explain everything. Each provides a piece of the puzzle, but the whole remains fractured, incomplete. And perhaps that is why the story endures. The corpse of room 104 resists being pinned down, existing instead in the space between explanations where mystery thrives. More than a century has passed since a chambermaid opened the door to room 104 and found a man who was, in every way, a riddle. In that moment, his anonymity became his identity. His silence became his voice. He left behind no name, no past, no one to claim him, only scraps of paper filled with warnings of judgment and a body that bore the marks of struggle. And yet, his absence of self became larger than any life he might have lived. He became legend, myth, a story too strange to fade. The corpse of room 104 is not remembered for who he was, but for what he represented: the terror of the unknown, the fear of hidden orders moving beneath the surface of ordinary life, the uneasy sense that even in the most refined of places, a grand hotel with polished floors and velvet drapes, darkness can slip in unnoticed. His mystery reminds us that human beings crave explanations, and when answers are denied, we invent them. We turn men into spies, prophets, martyrs, and ghosts because the truth, that some things will never be known, is harder to accept. Yet his story still resonates because it touches something timeless. We still fear the idea of forces beyond our sight, of societies meeting in shadows, of death arriving without reason or closure. We still turn our unclaimed dead into symbols, giving them voices long after they are gone. The man in room 104 was buried in a pauper's grave, but in another sense, he has never been laid to rest. He lives on every time the story is told, every time his prophecy is whispered, every time a new generation shivers at the thought of a corpse without a name. Perhaps that is his true legacy, not the notes he carried nor the bruises he bore, but the way his mystery forces us to confront the limits of knowledge. The corpse of room 104 will never confess, never resolve, never provide the comfort of a conclusion. He will remain in the shadows of New York's history, watching from the silence, his trumpet forever waiting to sound. If you've listened this far into his story, thank you for walking through the shadows with us. Be sure to subscribe to the Macabre Record for more forgotten mysteries and unsettling histories that slip between fact and folklore. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight?